If you're in tech and you're not learning from Conan going viral or Caitlin Clark going viral or every Steve Jobs project ever, you need to catch up because it's about how these three people approach originality, authenticity, that one's huge, and failure. Before we dig in, some quick context. Unless you've been off the internet, you know Conan's Hot Ones episode has gone viral. It's what many people are calling the best episode in history. We go all the way from Conan saying,
I never saw Spice till I was about 52 years old.
To near the end where he says,
I'm fine. I'm perfectly fine.
We'll learn from Conan everything between those two moments and even more from his career. For Caitlin Clark, if we think back a couple years to Bill Burr's bit where he says,
Dude, look at the WNBA.
Caitlin Clark's in college ball, but you get the idea.
They have been playing in front of 300 to 400 people a night for a quarter of a century.
We'll come back to that bit, but fast forward to what happened this year, where the women's NCAA championship game was literally
the most watched basketball game, period, in 5 years. Men's, women's, college, NBA.
There's a ton to learn from how that happened and why. And finally, we all know the popular side of Steve Jobs, and tech drama always gets eyeballs, like Facebook being dramatized in The Social Network.
Let's gut the freaking nerd.
Which, yes, you saw that right. The mouth movement and the recorded dialogue are not the same. Watch again.
Let's gut the freaking nerd.
Nonetheless, the drama earned $250 million at the box office. Now, Jobs wasn't shy about his opinions, and he could be even more dramatic. I'm going to destroy Android because it's a stolen product. We're not done yet. I'm willing to go to thermonuclear war on this, which is, admittedly, pretty dramatic. But there's a lesser known side to Jobs that relates to these three things, and I think there's more to learn from that than some of the sensationalized drama. So let's get started with originality. With Conan, you know from the first title card that he's going to be different.
I brought my personal physician, Dr. Arroyo. This is Dr. Arroyo.
Hi, how are you?
Amazing. Hi, nice to meet you.
No one's done this across 9 years of Hot Ones.
You don't have to talk to him, just to me. Just get a baseline temperature.
And we set the tone right away.
Been my doctor for about 25 years.
Yeah.
Where did you go to medical school?
In 1998.
Where'd you go to medical school? In 1998. Then he says,
Where?
Oh, out of state.
You should go.
Okay.
Dr. Arroyo there becomes our first narrative motif, a recurring theme. By the way, Jobs does narrative motifs all the time, but he does it with structure. The iPod video.
Like every great classic story, I've divided it into 3 acts.
His Stanford commencement speech.
Today, I want to tell you 3 stories from my life.
He crafts these narrative motifs, these themes that recur like no one else.
An iPod, a phone, and an internet communicator. An iPod, a phone. Are you getting it?
Now, for Conan, because he's a guest on a talk show, he does a second really critical motif. It's not a structure like Jobs, but it's a baseline, which is Conan repeatedly saying,
This is nothing.
and then
I've yet to had any spice at all.
this builds confidence around the idea that he's completely unaffected by spice. So now we have 2 motifs. You get motif number 1.
Dr. Arroyo,
Yes, sir.
let's get a baseline pulse here.
Yeah.
It's starting to race a
Oh,
little bit.
sure.
He continues that same dynamic.
You're just choking.
So
me.
sorry.
No, you just feel for the pulse.
All right. Yeah.
You've been with me for a long time, but
Yeah, it's there.
okay.
And we get motif number 2.
I don't think there's a wing on this table that I cannot devour like it's Cool Whipped Cream.
which builds and builds throughout the gauntlet into Da Bomb.
Oh my gosh.
It is the most angry, awful flavored sauce in the entire lineup.
Oh my gosh.
But Conan completely doubles down on the motif.
Come on, man, are we doing this or not?
Yeah, no, I'm with
Are
you.
we doing it or not?
No, I'm on the same
What's
page.
the point of even being alive?
By doubling down on these patterns, we get one of the most original ways to approach being interviewed. And it goes completely off the rails, which we'll show more of in a bit. But if you tried and you fed ChatGPT every other Hot Ones transcript, it couldn't come close to being able to put together half of what we've seen here, because Conan's not interested in copying others. He hasn't done that in his career, and he's not doing that in this interview. Now, when we see game-changing stuff in tech, stuff that actually changes things, it's rarely incremental. It can be divisive, sure, but at least it's original. Again, we'll talk about AI Pin a bit later, and we'll come back to Conan, but the key is this. He does stuff in his own way. And so does Caitlin Clark. If you don't know the story of Caitlin Clark, let's start with this. In 8 weeks this year, she broke 3 of the most notable records in basketball history. So here, Iowa's playing Michigan. This is February. And it's the first quarter. Michigan misses the shot. Gabby Marshall recovers. Straight to Caitlin Clark.
Here comes Clark. How will she go for history?
Let's pause. And first, let's rewind. Look how far back in the court she is. For reference, that's half court. But look at this. She says,
how will she go for history?
Pause again. Why did she say for history? Because if Clark makes this shot, she will beat the all-time college career point record in Division I women's basketball. Before we resume, prep yourself for 3 sounds in very quick succession. 1, the sound of the ball on impact. 2, the briefest of silences. And 3, the crowd's reaction. Listen to that again. It is the second most satisfying audio waveform in basketball history. But that's just one record. Watch this. We're just 2.5 weeks later, they're playing Ohio State, and you hear
This for college basketball history.
Pause. She just made college basketball history. So why is he saying that at this game? Because right at this moment, Caitlin Clark became
The all-time leading scorer in major college basketball history.
Now she's broken the women's record and the men's record, all while creating the first most satisfying audio waveform in basketball history. Now, if you're in tech and you think that these things are just a part of success, you're right. But with Clark, that momentum led to the third and a very different kind of record. This is all within 8 weeks, because this time, the women's championship game became, as we now know,
The most watched basketball game, period, in 5 years.
But why? If you look at Clark's history, originality, just being herself, was at the core. Her parents, in fact,
struggled to find teams where there were girls that were pretty competitive and was gonna, help me get better.
So she doesn't care. She moves over to the boys' teams until around 6th grade, saying,
It never was like, oh, why am I playing with the boys? It was just what I did.
And that competition goes all the way back to that time.
Those are some of the boys that know I would beat them one-on-one, so it's funny they would admit that, but it's honestly, I think a huge reason of who I am is growing up and playing that way.
So what does she get from this? And what can we learn? Well, over time, she builds this super competitive style into her approach. She takes what she felt early on.
All I wanted to do was win, no matter if it was a board game, a card game, really anything. I just was going to do whatever it took to win.
She brings that into her college career. And she realizes to get there on a technical level, actual achievement, she sets out to do what Steph Curry did, who got so good at the three-pointer that he holds the all-time NBA record.
Here's Curry for the record. It's good!
But in women's college ball, Clark became so good at the three-pointer. And when she makes those shots, she's getting 50% more points over just a two-pointer, because that's how math works. Of course, Clark explains it like this.
I was never I need to make really long three-pointers. It was just kind of something that evolved in my game and something that I really embraced and the crowd embraced and fans embraced. So, it's probably people's favorite part of my game.
Now, competition itself, you could say, is not an original trait, but it is embracing that kind of journey, a whole way of doing something that's not following everyone else's path. That is huge. It lets Caitlin Clark do things that are very obviously and measurably beyond what I think anyone could predict. Also, it's worth noting she recently broke Steph Curry's NCAA record for three-pointers within a season, and it was during that same 8-week period. Now, for Steve Jobs, when it comes to being original, yes, we can look at the obvious. We can look at Macintosh or iMac or iPhone. There was no fear of being different, of being original. But for Jobs, with originality, I want to do something different. There's 2 examples, 2 different parts of his career, actually 2 different companies. The first one, this side of Jobs, is probably the most studied.
The problem with them is really sort of in the bottom 40 there. It's this stuff right here.
This is the original iPhone keynote, 2007, and Jobs goes up and says that the problem is
They all have these keyboards that are there whether you need them or not to be there. And they all have these control buttons that are fixed in plastic.
And they solve it, of course, by getting rid of everything else
and just make a giant screen. A giant screen.
And if that description sounds familiar, look at literally any mobile phone today. Like Caitlin Clark in her college career, Jobs was intensely focused on changing the game. But Ballmer, this is Steve Ballmer, who was CEO of Microsoft, he very famously reacted to the announcement.
I said, that is the most expensive phone in the world, and it doesn't appeal to business customers because it doesn't have a keyboard, which makes it not a very good email machine.
Of course, it's easy to point out almost 2 decades later how wrong he was, but in fairness, I did something with that edit of Ballmer, which is going to relate, bizarrely enough, to AI Pin. But 3 people being original in 3 very different ways, different industries. Conan, even just in Hot Ones, changing the game. Clark, even just at 22 years of age, changing the game. And of course, Jobs. And this may seem obvious because the original iPhone became the fastest selling smartphone in history, and I don't have to tell you how big it's become. But I also said there's a second story. I want to talk about a side of Jobs that not a lot of people focus on. It's not about Apple. Everyone knows those stories. Instead, I want to talk about a totally different record he broke with a different team. This is the second example. In 1995, he spoke at SIGGRAPH 95. He comes on stage to talk about a project his company Pixar was working on. And you'll never believe how he kicks it off.
I want to talk about 3 things today.
We'll come back to what those 3 things are, but the film, of course, is Toy Story. Back in 86, this is 1986, Jobs bought Pixar from George Lucas. Originally, they were going to sell the Pixar image computer. He didn't buy Pixar to make films originally, but over time, that changed. And 9 years later, Toy Story becomes
the first completely computer-generated feature-length motion picture.
Which doesn't just gross a ton of money at the box office, which doesn't just release to absolute critical acclaim, which doesn't just get nominated for 3 Oscars and receive a Special Achievement Academy Award. But when Jobs takes Pixar public, which is like just a week after Toy Story comes out, it becomes the biggest IPO of 1995. Although the whole Pixar selling hardware and software thing, although that didn't take off, they did something far more original. And today, most would argue that Toy Story did for animation what iPhone did for mobile phones. The story of SIGGRAPH 95, though, goes way deeper. But to get there, we have to shift gears from originality to authenticity. Let's start with Conan. One way he shows up really authentically is in his self-deprecation. Now, where some people might get a laugh by tearing down others, Conan has absolutely no fear of just being himself, making fun of himself. Even here with the final sauce, the last dab experience, he literally takes a swig. He pauses for a moment and eventually says,
"What's wrong with me? Why can't I feel?"
At this stage, there is no vanity, there's no more calm, he is fully committed, which is why when Sean tries to wrap up by saying,
Conan O'Brien, the good news is that's a wrap on our lunch date with the Wings of Death. We're here about to drop.
He can't finish that sentence because Conan jumps in to insist,
I'm fine. I'm perfectly fine.
I'm not
You didn't come
questioning
up
that.
with one
I'm not
wing that
questioning
had
that.
any effect on Conan, because he's here to stay.
self-deprecation is where Conan shines. But to understand deeper, let's go back to 2016.
Oh, that's Nike? Look what I'm doing, pretty smart. Nike up here, Reebok down here. I get paid twice.
No.
Again, he's knowingly establishing himself as ridiculous, so Kevin Hart can come in and say,
You don't karate kick at the no.
Of course, he has to explain to Conan.
You don't get paid twice. They have no idea that you're wearing them.
But Conan doubles down, just like he's doing in Hot Ones. But here he says,
I just got the word out.
No, you
Nike up here, Reebok down there. These sneakers, we don't even know who made them. They're Romanian.
No, okay.
My point is, I get paid 3 times. I ripped my whole ass when I did that. This is filling with blood.
And that comfort he has, where he commits to a bit involving something ridiculous, usually about himself.
Conan, I bet you were wild in your college days.
Oh man, I was balls to the wall. I put it up there and I saw if it would stick. I rolled that onion all the way down.
That's what hits so hard in the final 6 minutes of Hot Ones, because we've gone from
This is nothing.
all the way up to this.
I've never felt so high.
I love it.
And it's that ability to have that full range of expression. It requires someone who is 100% comfortable being both the calm and collected guy
I don't fear your wings, man.
and the person who screams.
This is a guy who's just being on a show, and it's legitimate. So I say here's to you, Sean. You're a great mother host.
Right back
And I'm
to
glad
you.
I'm here.
This is uniquely Conan. But before we move on to Clark and Jobs, there is another aspect of Conan, because although he has these great narrative motifs, these callbacks, and he has a brilliant comedic mind and timing, all of it, it's nothing compared to the other reason that Conan is so successful. Sean, who is seriously a world-class interviewer, he asks,
Do you take any kind of perverse pride in the sheer number of hours of television that you've created?
and Conan's response is sincere.
I was never that excited about volume. To me, it's whether it's good or not.
It's these personal insights that lead to that authenticity. In fact, he tells a story about getting to host late night.
And then this crazy situation develops. 1 in a billion chance where I get a chance to audition for that show and then get it.
And even when he got the job,
There's the early era in 93 to 95 where I'm living in sheer terror all the time because I'm waiting for a phone call any second that I've been canceled.
that's what's different from just self-deprecation, because as much as he jokes, his relationship with not just the audience, but with his team, his cast and his crew, it's famously supportive. He can be authentically himself, but he gives credit to his team and he gives them space to shine. So Similarly, we could talk about Caitlin Clark, who, on the other hand, could do the exact opposite, because with stats like hers, she could very easily take a ton of credit for her and for Iowa's success, her team. But listen to how she widens her message beyond just her. Actually, first, let's go back to Bill Burr on the WNBA so we can get a baseline.
Yeah. So, the money listens. You'd rather watch that? Real Housewives, bunch of women just tearing each other down.
But listen to this.
That's the message you sent. We would rather watch that than see a bunch of women come together as a team and try to achieve a common goal. We would rather watch them absolutely destroy each other.
If that is the prompt, if that's the problem, or that's the question that's posed, here comes Caitlin Clark just 2 years later with the answer. Again, not about her, not about Iowa.
You know, there's Iowa fans all across the country, but there's also just basketball fans and people that just appreciate the game and want to watch and support women doing really great things.
Which is so far beyond her as an individual. In fact, she goes on to say,
freshman and sophomore Caitlin would have thought the world was ending if she didn't do all these things for her team.
Because over those years, she grew to the point of being able to say,
I'm always going to be able to impact this game, whether I'm scoring, whether I'm not, but also just being a good leader and being there for my teammates.
At 22, Caitlin Clark is balancing not just being a technical overachiever, which she of course is, but she's balancing that with being a team player. For her team, for Iowa, for women, for the whole sport. That level of authenticity is an incredible model. And by the way, it doesn't just affect how women look at the game. Now, what about jobs? Let's go back for a second to 1995.
I want to talk about three things today.
The first thing he talks about is the 100-year anniversary of the motion picture. That was in 1995. That's the first thing. Now, and if you're used to Steve Jobs' keynotes, you're probably expecting him to say Toy Story is a breakthrough on the scale of stuff like Technicolor, Snow White, or Star Wars.
It's a breakthrough on the scale of Technicolor, Snow White, and Star Wars.
But to be fair to Jobs, it absolutely was. We do, however, tend to have a selective memory about these things because this next side of Jobs is so often overlooked. In fact, he actually spent most of part one celebrating the history of achievements in filmmaking.
And Walt Disney trained their animators in color theory and produced the first color films, the Silly Symphony cartoons, which won several Academy Awards.
But when he gets to the second topic is about scale and complexity. Watch what he does.
Just as an example, Woody has 723 animation control points, all of them available to the animators or actors to animate Woody. 212 of them are on the face, 58 of them on the mouth alone.
This is a guy who's up on stage just proudly nerding out about his team's achievements. And some people focus on Jobs as kind of just the sales and marketing guy, or sometimes they say that because he wasn't an engineer, he never actually pioneered anything, which is, of course, an opinion that, in addition to being wrong, misses out on maybe his most effective quality. This is Larry Ellison in 2012.
Every excruciating detail he was personally involved in.
Larry and Steve were best friends.
He would call me up and say, Larry, let's get together. You know, we saw each other a lot. And he'd come over to my house. I'd go over to his house. I said, Steve, I'm not coming over if you make me watch Toy Story again.
And so Steve would say,
so Larry, you got to see, you won't believe the different the shadows look.
Steve was famously proud of his team's work. And at SIGGRAPH 95, he had every right to take a bow and celebrate that achievement. So what does he do in part 3, which he titles A Place in History? He says something completely unexpected.
The computer graphics community has been climbing the wall of the castle for 20 years, standing on each other's shoulders, and made immense progress, as we've seen today.
He's not just talking about Pixar.
And I think that that is an achievement that many people in this room should take proud ownership in.
So, who's the authentic Steve Jobs? Is it the guy we know by his keynotes at Apple or the stuff about Android? In his book Blink, Malcolm Gladwell talks about thin slicing. So this is our ability, our unconscious mind's ability to find patterns that are based on very narrow slices of experience, snap judgments. Watch the Ballmer clip again on iPhone.
$500 fully subsidized with a plan? I said, that is the most expensive phone in the world, and it doesn't appeal to business customers because it doesn't have a keyboard, which makes it not a very good email machine.
A lot of us could base our opinion of Ballmer or Microsoft at the time on like 1 or 2 sentences. And similarly, we can thin slice Pixar on paper and talk about its technical achievements. But it's not just that, because Pixar tells some of the best stories. It's not one or the other. Jobs took this moment to celebrate both of those things, but not just about his team, but the people who came before, so Pixar could stand on the shoulders of giants. These are three people who are known for something, but there's often a side, a more authentic side we overlook because it's just not as flashy. But what might define them best is failure. Let's start this time with Caitlin Clark because we know she's competitive, but if we go back...
I think, especially when I was younger, I really struggled with understanding losing.
She goes on to say,
whenever I would lose, when I was in either softball, basketball, whatever it was, I would just cry. That was my immediate reaction.
Which is, of course, a completely normal feeling. But Clark says,
I think it's been something that I've been able to balance, especially as my career's gone on.
But here's my favorite part from this interview.
Nobody ever said you're going to have a perfect record, and a lot of the losses in my career have really fueled me to be who I am today, whether it was getting upset my sophomore year in the round of 32 to Creighton.
Round of 32 is the second round of March Madness, and her team lost that round in what Clark describes as
probably one of the worst losses in my entire basketball career.
But here's how she looks at it now.
I'm not sure if I don't have that loss, are we as good? I don't think so. So I think being able to learn that and understand that as my career's gone on has been really important for myself.
That mentality is obviously critical in sports, and it served Clark very well. With Conan, he was on nightly, so failure was usually a pretty quick turnaround. Except for this.
NBC found that out a few months ago when Conan O'Brien, the newly installed host of The Tonight Show, quit after the network announced it was going to push The Tonight Show into tomorrow and to give its traditional time slot back to O'Brien's predecessor, Jay Leno.
It's how Conan talked about this situation years later that sticks with me.
So at the age of 47, after 25 years of obsessively pursuing my dream, that dream changed. For decades in show business, the ultimate goal of every comedian was to host The Tonight Show. It was the holy grail. And like many people, I thought that achieving that goal would define me as successful.
Which, of course, is not uncommon. But he goes on to say,
but that is not true. No specific job or career goal defines me, and it should not define you. In 2000, I told graduates to not be afraid to fail. And I still believe that. But today I tell you that whether you fear it or not, disappointment will come. The beauty is that through disappointment you can gain clarity, and with clarity comes conviction and true originality.
I don't think Conan's popular just because he's funny. I think his words on failure, and especially if you listen to his podcast, the way he just treats other people, this is someone who is imperfect and weird and shares those things so that some of us can feel okay about being imperfect and weird ourselves. Conan does that no matter how overwhelmingly funny / genius / uncomfortably bizarre it ends up getting. That's the bigger reason that Conan isn't just original and isn't just authentic. It's because he talks about his failures, the things he struggles with. And I think for Steve Jobs, the first time he did this in a very public way at least was in 2005 at Stanford.
We just released our finest creation, the Macintosh, a year earlier, and I just turned 30. And then I got fired. How can you get fired from a company you started?
I think everyone knows this story, but it gets so real when he says this.
What had been the focus of my entire adult life was gone, and it was devastating. I really didn't know what to do for a few months. I felt that I had let the previous generation of entrepreneurs down, that I had dropped the baton as it was being passed to me.
But here's the really important perspective.
I didn't see it then, but it turned out that getting fired from Apple was the best thing that could have ever happened to me. The heaviness of being successful was replaced by the lightness of being a beginner again, less sure about everything. It freed me to enter one of the most creative periods of my life.
All three of these people, in totally unique ways, by the way, they learned over time to see something different in failure. Conan leaving NBC gave him tons of freedom on CBS. It let him start one of the biggest podcasts ever, which he sold to Sirius for like $150 million. Not to mention, he has a new show on Max where he travels the world connecting with fans. And how about Caitlin Clark? Did she stop after losing the championship game this season? Of course not. 6 days later, she's on SNL getting ready for the WNBA. And just as Jobs used his moment in 1995 to celebrate those who came before him, Clark does the same right here.
It's just one step for the WNBA, thanks to all the great players like Cheryl Swoops, Lisa Leslie, Cynthia Cooper, the great Dawn Staley, and my basketball hero, Maya Moore. These are the women that kicked down the door so I could walk inside.
And of course, Jobs getting fired from the company he founded let him go on to build teams that changed personal computing and animated films and retail and music and the music industry and phones and tablets. It goes on and on. All three of them are defined by how they respond to failure. And that leads me to what all three of them can teach us in tech. Originality isn't always celebrated right away. Ballmer said of iPhone,
That is the most expensive phone in the world, and it doesn't appeal to business customers because it doesn't have a keyboard, which makes it not a very good email machine.
but the next sentence, which people usually forget about, is, and I'll show it now, it's the honest admission.
Now, it may sell very well or not.
Ballmer was just talking about iPhone for business customers, which did take time to catch on. And it was one of the most expensive phones. But we thin slice these things and we make these quick judgments, especially when something is different. Everyone right now is responding the same way to Humane, talking about how AI Pin is the worst product. But we're thin slicing again. My favorite thing Marques Brownlee said about the AI Pin was this, and I think this is why I respect him so much as a tech reviewer.
If you ask me, like, who should buy this device right now? I mean, nobody should buy this device right now, but if there's one person who would most consider it, it's the person that wants to spend as little time as possible with a screen in their hands. Like, as little time as possible on their phone. That's me sometimes. I don't want to doom scroll the second I pull my phone out of my pocket. For that person, if they want that at the expense of everything else, this device represents just a glimmer of hope for that future.
It's easy to pile on, but Marques demonstrates being original and authentic all the time. He goes deep and he shares his opinions, and he's usually right. But with AI Pin, everyone else piles on and focuses on that one part of that headline. And yeah, it may hold a bit of truth, but Bill Burr had a point, but it wasn't just about the WNBA.
Come together as a team and try to achieve a common goal. We would rather watch them absolutely destroy each other.
That's the challenge of originality. And so sometimes the uncomfortable question we have to ask each other is, what's your original opinion? What are you building? Everyone is entitled to their whatever, but for me, I'd rather be part of something different and at least try for originality rather than being part of something incremental that's a tiny optimization of whatever the existing thing is. That's originality. That's what Conan does for comedy. It's what Clark does in sports. It's what Jobs did in tech. And by doing it authentically, we can ask ourselves, does what I do matter to me, even if it's unconventional? Conan can make fun of himself, and he can completely disregard how everyone else does something in favor of being more of himself.
There you go. I said, how much wood could a woodchuck chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood?
So does Caitlin Clark. She sticks to her roots. She didn't just decide to play with boys teams early on. She didn't just decide to break a bunch of records. She's being true to her competitive nature and redefining what's possible in the sport. And Steve Jobs didn't just go after big ideas.
iPhone runs OS 10.
Jobs wanted to leave behind. He talked a lot about wanting to build a body of work. But he connected that vision with what he and his teams ended up actually building. Now, none of us have to be Steve Jobs or Caitlin Clark or Conan. We just have to find our own passion and follow it. And when we fail, there's maybe the biggest lesson of all. Failure to Conan turned into new possibilities. Failure to Clark continues to shape who she is. And failure to Jobs drove him to try more things, to learn, to grow, and to change things. Yeah, it's a comedian and an athlete and an entrepreneur, but to me, they're three people that decided to be different. Figma thought differently about collaborating on designs. It didn't matter that there was already Sketch and Illustrator, and it didn't just change the way we design. Figma set the standard. They set the standard for what real-time collaboration is supposed to be in all software. Webflow thought differently about developing for the web by developing visually. It didn't matter that there was WordPress or hand coding, and now no-code apps and visual development, these are expected for most software. OpenAI even created ChatGPT. They did this as a demo. Of course, when people played around with it, it became the fastest growing user base in history. And now different models can compete. And that chat interface is a global standard. History is built on new ideas and discovery. No one changed anything by copying and pasting. Because in a time where it seems like AI is changing everything in good ways and not so good ways, I think it's more important than ever to realize that how we approach these three things can define the kind of legacy each of us leave behind. Now, if you want to learn more about software and AI, things like this, make sure to subscribe or follow. This year, I'm making courses that teach how to use software and AI. So if you're in tech, definitely stay tuned. Thanks, everybody.